Hey everybody, I want to make a short video called the 5 practices to make your construction or building project a success. So the first one, check your work in 2 or 3 different ways. So when I'm on the job site, I found it really important when I'm working with my guys and my subcontractors that they check the work in a couple of different ways. So the first way is, let's just say, the easiest example is, let's say you're trying to find the center point on a wall, which we recently did in a guest house that we're building. So one way to do it is to measure out the distance from one end to the other of the wall, and then split that in half, and then mark that point. And then come back and then measure from one side to the next, the exact same measurement, like you can be an inch long or an inch short, it doesn't really matter. You measure that and you make a mark, measure the other side, make a mark, and then you come back and you compare those two. So if the center point is exactly the same distance between those 2 marks that you just made, then you did it right. And what happens a lot of times is it didn't work out. So one of those methods was off. So and then you go back and figure out which method was off, and then you get the right point. So the practice is in any way that you can think of 2 or 3 ways to check your work, not just 2 or 3 times, which is the common thing that you hear in construction, lore. So the old construction adage, measure twice, cut once, that's really not enough. You can do that, and that's very helpful, but in order to be really successful, especially when you're taking on complex projects, you want to measure in different ways. So that's one way to measure in different ways. Another way is to, for example, check your angles in different ways. So let's say you have a speed square, you stick it on the pivot, and then you move the pivot along the board until you get the degrees that correspond to 22.5 degrees. And then you make your mark and you make your line. And then you come back and check with your angle finder, so a little tool that bends at the angle. Check that angle finder, make sure, and then you can take it over to, let's say you have a chop saw, and you can check and make sure your chop saw is at 22.5 degrees. And then you can go back to whatever cut you're making and put your angle finder in there and see if that was actually 22.5 degrees. And if everything is right, then you go ahead and make the cut. And then another way, for example, a lot of guys are math oriented, so they'll use math to calculate their angles. So once you use the math to calculate your angles, then go back and use the angle finder and check to see if the angle was in fact right, if you can. There's almost always several different ways that you can check your work to make sure that it's accurate. So when you're doing a project and let's say you're learning as you go, you want to, the best way to make the best work that is structurally sound and aesthetically beautiful is to start with those parts of the project, as long as the order kind of makes sense. You can mess with the order of your construction a little bit. So start with the least visual, actually start with the least structurally important, and then the least visual. So you work your way from your least structurally important detail to your least visual detail. And then as you do that, you just get better. You get better along the process. So for example, I'm always telling my guys, start with the back corner of the project, where no one's rarely ever going to go, or the bottom down by the ground. Start by there. Or start with a detail that doesn't have any load-bearing capacity, or doesn't have any issues with water infiltration. Start with those details, work those out, and then inevitably you'll discover that certain things aren't as good as they could be. So that brings us to the third principle. The third principle is to always adjust. You're always looking at what you do and adjusting it and trying to make it a little bit better. And this applies to everywhere in life. So for example, if you're driving 3 nails through a stud into the bottom plate and you're toe-nailing them from the sides, 2 on one side and 1 on the other, check and see your wood depth. Like, how far in did the nail go? Did it crack the wood? Did it go at a right angle that was going to get it as much penetration as possible without cracking the wood? And then continually adjust your depth finder on your framing nailer, and then continually adjust your angle and adjust your pressure and adjust how you're looking at it, and then keep adjusting as you go. And then when you notice something, so this happens a lot on our job sites, you notice something didn't go wrong, didn't go right. And then you go back, and it is literally worth the time. A lot of guys I find, they put their head down and they want to keep going. And then they make the same mistake next time. So just stop, take a break, and then think through the steps that you took and figure out where the error likely occurred. Now, every time you're not going to be able to figure out where the error likely occurred, but a lot of times you will. And then once you figure that out, you try it the next time. And when you try it the next time, most likely you'll get it right. And if it doesn't, then you just keep doing that. And you don't worry about whether you learn the lesson the first time. You just keep noticing more details. Keep noticing more details. And at the same time that you're noticing more details, you're also working with efficiency, trying to make your cut a little bit faster and a little bit cleaner, or your screw or your nail or whatever. So a lot of times when I notice guys put their head down and they keep going, you end up, and then the siding is put on all cockeyed, or the window doesn't match. So one of the things that is very important to do is to think through as many steps as you've already learned in your head in terms of layers or next steps. So if you can think through or have written down smaller projects, you may or may not write them down. It depends on your personal style of doing projects. Writing down is beneficial. I tend to be somewhere in the middle, where I write down more complex projects and don't write down smaller projects because they're already in my head. But I think through to the farthest step out that I can. So if I'm framing, I'll think through the framing, then I'll think through the sheathing, then I'll think through the vapor barrier, then I'll think through the drainage plane, then I'll think through the exterior siding, and I'll think through the windows, I'll think through the flashing, I'll think through the water infiltration, and then I'll think through the final visual details of where the roof line meets the ground line, meets the side, meets the trims, and I have that whole image. So I create an image in my mind of how all those layers are supposed to look and how they interact with one another. And then from that image, as I'm going through the building process, I notice, if I do this, if I move this 2x4 over another 2 inches, it's going to be easier for me to nail on the same plane with my siding. Or it's going to be easier for me to align my furring strips for my drainage plane. Or it's going to be easier for me to put my flashing around my windows so that there's no water infiltration. So I would say at a minimum, you want to be either 5 steps out or to the end of your project, whichever comes first. And you want to think of it through every different angle. So again, this idea of looking at things from different ways. So look at your project from the outside, look at your project from the inside, look at your project from the structural up, look at your project from the rain down, look at your project from the heat in, look at your project from the occupancy use out, and just keep doing that. I think the day, and this is especially appropriate for DIYers, for remodelers, and for people doing custom projects. You have to rely on your own visualization and design in order to get it right. If you're not very visual, use more. If you don't have images in your head, use more paper, use more SketchUp, use more whatever you need for that. If you're visual in your head, then just keep adding those layers up. And a combination of the two is always the best. Let's see. This is an efficiency idea. So a few years back, I watched a really funny episode of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. And in that episode, one of the bar owners had a nephew who was OCD. And he came into the bar and he was putting everything away. And the bar was running like a top. And he would run around and just put everything away. And then the guys, they sort of realized that they were losing their character because it was the whole clientele was changing, and they didn't want it. They sort of moved back to this less efficient, more sort of loose thing that they wanted. And while they were doing that, the character was this young kid with OCD was starting to freak out, and he was saying, a place for everything in its place, a place for everything in its place, and just starting to melt down because everything was in disarray. So, a lot of times we try to not get anxious about things. And I've been consciously cultivating a disdain for disorder. It's very easy on a construction project, if you're not super organized to begin with, to let tools and materials spread. So the principle that we've started to apply, which we're not 100% at, is after each phase, After each phase, we stop, organize, put away the tools, and then start the next phase. Sometimes on smaller projects it's not going to work, but for a medium to large project, it works great. When you're moving from framing to sheathing, or when you're moving from a framing one wall to the next wall, depending on how big the wall is, or just depending on the tools that you're going to use, just each time you reorder and assess. And then I hear people say this a lot that are especially more relaxed and just kind of like cruiser, because there's two types. There's the super anxious people, and then there's the more cruiser people. So this is more for the cruiser people. You got to put everything away in the same place every time, for yourself and for your coworkers. It's just every time, everything in the same place. You save so much time. We have a term in our job site we call grab spacing. And grab spacing occurs, so what grab spacing is you grab something, you walk it around somewhere, and you put it down. And you have no idea that you did it. So we'll be constantly talking about, oh, where's that? It's like, oh, I think I grab spaced it. So when somebody starts grab spacing, or you start grab spacing, there's too much chaos, either in your mind or on the job site. So to avoid that, and to avoid looking for things, you always put it back in its place. Another really solid rule about that is what I call no burying. So you never bury things. I'm still on my guys about that. They'll take a tool and then they'll drop a cut piece of wood on top of it. And then nobody else knows where it is because it's buried on top of a piece of wood. They don't even know what it is because they probably grab spaced it there. So if you just put it in your mind that every tool that you use, every piece of wood, that basically the tools and pieces of wood that you need, they never get buried under something else. It doesn't really matter how you organize them, they just have to not be buried. So that's it for this video. There are more practices that we use that I'll share in another video, but that's all I got for now. So choose one of these things to do if you like this video. Either subscribe, like the video, share it, or visit the website lushplanet.net. Don't get overwhelmed. They always tell me when I try to learn about YouTube videos not to tell you to do more than one thing. But I also believe that if you're empowered to do what works best for you, then do that. So do one of those things. You don't have to do all four, just do one. Whichever one is easiest for you. If it's the subscribe or like or comment or go to the webpage. So thanks for watching, and I hope your project is even more successful and that this information was very useful for you, and have a wonderful day.